Good morning.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Scotty.
So nice to be doing things with you yet again.
Yet again, over almost 50 years.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. Well, let's start with a nice, simple, broad question. What was your experience of the AIDS crisis in Santa Cruz like?
It started off as a distant thing. I was on the Public Health Commission, and I started reading Gay Community News, which is the only publication that was really covering AIDS. And I would come to the commission meetings, and they were run by the public health director. And I'd go, George, do you know how many gay men are here? Do you know how many San Francisco gay men spend the weekends here? We need to do something. We need to watch out. So that was in the early days. And then Jerry Solomon called me and said he wanted to do a conference, and he heard I'm good at PR. I have no idea where he heard that, but he took me to lunch, and we talked about how to do outreach. And I remember that conference a little bit. And then I was changing jobs. I went to Monterey for a while, and then the AIDS Project was hiring their second director. Gerald was stepping down. And I said, it's time to come home, and applied for it and got it. So that was the beginning.
So in the beginning, you became the executive director of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project.
Yes.
What was that like?
Oh, it was all encompassing. It was like you couldn't be part of that without it taking over your life.
Was it all set up? Was there a lot to do? Was it a small organization? How was it?
It was a pretty small organization. We were in the back room of the Seniors Council in Aptos, right next to Community Bridges. And it was food and nutrition then. And we started there, and then we got a little office on Soquel, which was the front two rooms of a motel almost. And we rented the front part, and then the second room became the headquarters for all the people with AIDS. That was their living room, basically. Do you remember that?
I don't. Tell me about that.
Well, let me back up a little bit. So when I came on, we really didn't have very much money. And there was a new grant coming down from the state. And George and I spent the weekend writing a grant for $100,000. And I wrote into that grant money to hire a therapist for us all. Because the whole staff, because it was growing. And it was a very important piece.
Why did the staff need a therapist?
Because we were dealing with people who were looking death in the face, right? There were so many people coming in who had no network anymore. Their families had abandoned them. They were completely alone. A lot of them had lost their jobs. So they needed a ton of support. And that meant for us to be accessible, we had to have our hearts open, you know. And that's a lot to take in all the time. The other thing, I was good friends with a bunch of directors from the Bay Area. They are much larger organizations in San Francisco and Oakland, and they were very clear that the helplessness of not being able to keep people alive in the early days really wore on the staff. And they also sometimes transferred that to the director, like subconsciously.
I mean, it became the director's fault.
Yes, yes. So that's, and I was the director, and that's really why I wanted therapy. For all of us to realize what was going on, you know. And we hired a therapist who had been an AIDS nurse. And that was really quite important and good.
Say a little more about the living room.
The living room. Well, The first person we hired after the coordinator working with people with AIDS was already hired, we needed an education director with this grant. And the woman we brought in, Ruth Moda, had this idea that we really needed to have people with AIDS tell their own story. And that had never been done before, that to my knowledge.
Tell it to whom?
To the community, to whoever wanted it. You know, I could speak for people when it was necessary, but most of the time it wasn't necessary. And if somebody called me and said, well, we want you to speak, well, can I bring a person with AIDS, or can I sub out? You know, didn't always work. Like with the Beast Clubs, with the Lions Club and those other clubs.
Beast Club.
That's what I always call them. They wanted the head, you know, so I always had to go to that. But the idea was for us to train a cadre of people living with HIV/AIDS to be public speakers. And it was incredibly successful. And the place where people would get together was in the living room next door. And that was really could be closed off as, you know, it's just for us today. And it's also sometimes where we did intake for new clients. And yeah.
It's what we might now call a safe space.
Exactly. We didn't have those words.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
What sort of services did Santa Cruz AIDS Project provide at the time?
We provided physical and emotional support for people. So we would find them housing if we could. We'd go to their group of volunteers. Every person with AIDS had a group of people around them, depending upon how much community support they already had or family support they already had. But we would fill in. So people got visited, they had someone helping them clean their house, they got food. Some people got a little bit of money to help support the meds they needed to take. It really was individualized, you know, just so people really felt taken care of.
It sounds pretty wraparound, too.
It was, which was a phrase we didn't have then.
I was thinking that. We didn't call it that
Yeah.
then either, right?
Yeah.
You and I, back then, also worked on a magazine called The Lavender Reader. Mm-hmm. You may remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. And every quarter, it was a quarterly magazine, there was a column by the Santa Cruz AIDS Project. And for a while, you would write that column. And let me read to you something you wrote in the spring of 1988. You said, "I thought I understood what the right wing was up to and how we could beat them at their game. Now, looking back at it, has it only been 2 months, I can honestly say that I was naive. Every week at the SCAP office, we received newsletters from Sacramento and Washington detailing dozens of pieces of legislation, proposing everything from banning AIDS education that mentions homosexuality and quarantining people with AIDS, to bills that would deny medical insurance coverage if AIDS were contracted from intravenous needle use or sex between men. Even when supportive legislation is introduced, supportive legislation such as providing funds for direct care of people with AIDS, the conservatives automatically propose amendments that would require mandatory testing and the reporting of those who are HIV positive. There are over 130 AIDS-related bills currently pending in the California State Legislature." Does that sound at all familiar?
It's today.
Exactly.
It's totally today, yeah. Yeah, it's the new boogeyman. Transgender youth are the new boogeyman. They see that as the weakest link in our coalition.
Say more what that was like then.
Well, it was a unifying factor, you know, for a lot of people in the community, and especially, in my experience, women in the community. So there were women who were very involved with the AIDS Project. But then there was also a separate group of lesbians and allies who weren't doing anything, but they picked up a lot of the political part and ran with it. You know, and when we were fighting, oh God, it was Prop 64.
Which was?
No gay school teachers.
No gay school teachers.
No allied school teachers, if they were going to talk about it in the classroom.
Right, John
It's like
Briggs.
being in Ohio now. I think Ohio has one of the strictest ones. So I came out of doing political work, like with you and other people, so I was really comfortable with that. And we fought 64. We also were one of the few statewide regional organizations that fought Prop 65.
Say more about that.
Prop 65 was the death penalty. And we did not want the death penalty. Yeah. So we were no on 64 and 65. And the only other group I could find doing that was a lesbian group out of Oakland. And I'm forgetting their name, but they had a catchy name. So we worked with them.
What I remember about that was the pushback we got doing No on 64, which was about gay teachers, as we said, was that we need to focus strictly on our issue. And if we focus on the death penalty as well, that will dilute our message. And also, the death penalty initiative is likely to lose, and we don't want to be allied with a losing initiative. Talk a little about the politics of that.
Oh, God. It was just open for discussion all the time, you know, and we never did. Well, organizationally, we came to consensus because we said no on both, and we were promoting both. But I think we had to do a lot of education about who ended up being killed through the death penalty, and what group of people, and how did they get there. And it was parallel to what we were experiencing, just that it was trauma that had been going on for decades, because it was all for black people and brown people. You know, very rarely was there a white person on the death row. You know, so we were trying to educate people about that this really was about excluding yet another group, you know, and that we were allies.
So the commonality was marginalized people.
Yes.
And how did your political experience lead you to want to be doing AIDS activism and AIDS project work?
Because it was my community. You know, my friends were dying. And I felt like I could do something, you know. And it was interesting to be the first woman, the first lesbian director, I think in the state. I'm not sure, but that's what I've been told. Our little group in Santa Cruz always was trying to be a cutting edge. But it was difficult and complicated when it was my personal friend, you know, like the person who was the editor of the Lavender Reader.
Yes, right. And the previous director of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project.
Yeah, yeah.
Gerald Landers.
Yeah.
I feel like that was an important thing about a lot of queer activism in Santa Cruz is we worked really hard to work in coalition, lesbians
Yes.
and gay men and
Yes.
queers in general. And that your directorship of the AIDS Project was yet another example of that, and another point of leadership, that Santa Cruz will take the lead in demonstrating that lesbians can be allies for the entire AIDS community.
Yeah, yeah. We got a little pushback, but then, you know, when I first started, we got pushback. The number of clients we had wasn't very big in the beginning. I think we had about 30 when I took over in '88. And they were a really wide variety of people. And what a lot of the gay men did not recognize was that other gay men were there because of two ways they could have gotten AIDS. They could have gotten AIDS from having sex, or they could have gotten AIDS from IV drug use. And a number of the gay men who got AIDS from sex did not realize that their colleagues had been shooting up. And someone actually came to me and said, that's not us. And we had a conversation. And I sat down and I said, okay, let me give you some data. 30% of you had 2 different ways you could have gotten AIDS. 30% of your group, who you love, right? Almost all of them had sex, but a lot of them identified as straight. So people had to recognize that the group they were part of, their living room group, was diverse in many other ways that they did not recognize. And once they got that you know, their friends were using IV drugs, that's what got them sick, and that there were other ways of being, and there were a lot of secrets.
Ah, secrets. Was that shocking to you or surprising to you?
No, not at all, because I had done a lot of work with the drug community, and as a person in recovery, I understood that.
Excellent. You weren't that old when you were SCAP director.
No.
You were mid-30s.
88. I was 36.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How was it being relatively young and in charge of something very important, very serious for the community?
You know, everybody was young. I didn't feel young. I felt like right in there, you know. So other people responded to me as if I was a kid.
How so?
I remember when we were moving from our first office to the office on Soquel, we had to build some walls. And of course, all the gay men who were into that came and built these walls, and I was painting it. And community hospital was down the block at that point in time. And 2 nurses came down wanting to meet the director. And I was in shorts and a shirt like this, and I'm there over there painting, and they walk in and they said, well, we're here to meet the director, Joe, thinking Joe was male, right? And certainly not me. And I said, I'm Joe. And they were like, they literally did a double take. I said, yeah, I'm Joe Kenny. Let me put this down and we can talk.
Put down my paint roller.
Yeah.
And go back into my role as ED.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we, there were times I could use that as a wedge or a way in to organizations, because some of the more straighter organizations, like the Beast Clubs I was talking about, they would invite me to come speak and not expect it to be very deep, because I was young, I was female, I had a role I had to play, and little did they know I never played that role. So it was a good way to get in and then blow them away in terms of giving them real facts about what was going on in the community. Like someone said to me at one of those, an insurance agent said, well, you need to get your clients to stop applying for insurance because we're going broke.
That's the problem.
And I said, well, let me tell you that problem from our perspective. I have 2 friends. One is ex-military, his partner, right? They have lived together for many, many, many years. They both have AIDS, right? The first person has pneumocystis pneumonia, which meant at that time you had to go into the hospital. The treatment was really intense. The other one started getting other kinds of diseases related to having no immune system. And they literally had to decide who was going to get treatment because the copay was so high. And these are two professional men. The copay was so high, they couldn't afford it, right? Being in the hospital with pneumocystis was $70,000, and this was in the 80s. So that's equivalent to what, $500,000 now? You know, they didn't have the money. So I turned it around and said, tell me how you would deal with that if that were your family or your client. Are you going to walk away?
What response did you get?
Not much. A little bit of embarrassment, and then the person who had invited me was in the back smiling. Yeah.
So you were a bit stealth in that.
Yeah. And then people, at the time we had ACT UP, which was the far left, doing street theater, doing street patrols, doing all these things to get the attention of the federal government to actually serve people with AIDS and bring people with AIDS into the fold to understand what people were going through, you know, because the doctors were this far away. And so ACT UP was over here, and then we had kind of the do-gooders, the church people. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. And then in the middle was the AIDS Project, SCAP, you know. So when people wanted to talk about what we were doing, I'd say, well, you have a choice. You can talk to me, or you can talk to ACT UP. They're outside now, on the street, lying on the street. You could go talk to them. It made me seem much more palatable.
And respectable.
And respectable.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little about the office. You mentioned you're painting the office. In the column after the one I read to you, you mentioned that you were turned down 4 times for office space because of AIDS phobia.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about that.
As soon as people found out who we were, like I could do all the talking, and then when I said what the organization was, they would, well, let me give you a call back, or let me think about that, and then I never heard from them. But the turned down ones, there were 4, where they just said, no, that wouldn't be, I can't rent to you.
What were they afraid of?
Stigma, being associated with us, having people reject them, which I found really interesting. As our client base grew, we got a bunch of different people, and some of whom were movers and shakers in their community, right? So there was this one person who was married and had kids and had HIV and then got AIDS, and he presented as a straight business person in Capitola. And he was very closely tied in with the Capitola City Council. So they knew he was sick, and they knew he was dying. And I had to go to them and ask them for money, because we go to all the municipalities to get government money. And when he died, I was so angry, because one of them came to his service. One of them, right? And this was a guy, he did the Begonia Festival. You know, he was in the community. And so when I had to go up before them, I was pissed. And I said, I'm not gonna beg you. I'm not gonna do the normal thing we do here. I said, you know the impact of this disease on your community. And I looked at every single one of them. and said, you need to step up and take care of the people in your community who are impacted by this. And that means supporting the AIDS Project. And it was so interesting. This is so typical. When we all finally gave our little spiel, because all the nonprofits were there, right? Child care and the food bank and everybody. The chair of the city council turned to one of the others and said, well, what about Scotts Valley? Did they give you money? And it was the first time that they gave us everything we asked for. And they gave everyone everything they asked for. And I know, I was one of the first persons speaking, so it changed the way people spoke to them. And it's like, this is your obligation. These are your constituents that we are serving, and we need your help. Whether we're doing child care or AIDS or other kinds of health care or feeding people, you know, we're all in this together. And they did it. They did.
You role modeled being a bit more confrontational for the other organizations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
In a very nice way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I held a mirror up to them. Yeah. And they knew who I was talking about.
You didn't mention the person.
I did not mention his name. Mm-hmm. You know, it was confidential. His family was confidential. They knew. Yeah. So.
SCAP had some pretty innovative early programs.
Oh God, yes.
I'm thinking of the peer educator program.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little about that?
It was the PWA program, right? Or, oh no, okay, so we had two different. One was people with AIDS educating in the community, going into the schools and doing all that stuff. And then we also had an IV drug use outreach program. And you will hear from Richard Smith later on, but he was a nurse, and he did all the outreach, particularly in Beach Flats, which was where a lot of the IV drug users got their drugs. And he decided that, unbeknownst to me, because I was out on sick leave, he decided he was going to start handing out clean needles, because that was a very important piece. People couldn't get clean needles. People were, multi-people were using the needles, and that's how they were getting infected. So he found a source, I do not remember where, and started distributing them. And then I came back from sick leave, and he told me. And I went, oh my God. This puts us in a very vulnerable place. We have to turn this around. So this was we were very grassroots. And there wasn't all this technology and all this graphic stuff. So we made an invitation to a party at my house, in my backyard. And it was, have you ever wanted to be part of the underground, right? And opened it up, and it was an invitation to come to this party and give money for needle distribution, to buy needles. And I invited the Board of Supervisors, the City Council, the Sheriff, the head of our board, which included the Public Health Director, and a bunch of them came. They came. And soon after that, we were able to work with the sheriff and the police department for our outreach workers to get official cards so they would not get arrested for distributing needles.
Needle exchange was a hot button topic then. I think it's still a hot button topic now.
It is.
That was very bold.
It was completely bold.
I'm a little surprised to hear that city council members, supervisors, the sheriff came to your party and were on board with this. It
took a lot of education. The invitation was accompanied by us talking to them. Marty Wormhout, you know, we had allies. We totally had allies, and those were the people who were the kind of encouraging the other people to come. But just getting the invitation was telling them, we're on the road, we're doing something risky, but we want you to be part of it.
Was there pushback?
Not that I saw. There may have been. The electeds may have been pushing back on one another, but they never told me.
What about the sheriff?
He didn't come, but he talked to the police chief, and they were on board with doing needle exchange.
That's a pretty progressive position.
Yes, it was.
Even now.
Yeah, I'm amazed that it's come back around again. You know.
Wow. No, I did not know that story.
Yeah. I loved it. I used to have a copy of the invitation. I'll have to look and see. I may have turned it in here. You know, it was handmade.
Of course.
Fourfold.
I'd love to see that.
Yes.
So in another one of the AIDS Project columns in the Lavender Reader, Stephen Noskowitz, who is a member of the board, mentioned, and I didn't really realize this, that the Santa Cruz AIDS Project was a model for a national model for AIDS projects of its size for the entire country.
It's amazing.
Tell me a little about that.
Well, we were willing to take risks and meet people where they were. So we had a really supportive board, which included the public health director for the county, and we just realized that there was no examples of how to do this stuff. Like Richard Smith doing outreach among IV drug users. It's like nobody was doing that. There wasn't public health doing it. There was, you know, and he had to go into the community and find people, you know, and then talk to them. How do we do that? And he did it so well, we were able to take that model of building community among gay men, IV drug users, by then straight people, and teach other communities, how do you do that outreach?
How'd you teach them?
We wrote things about it, and we went to conferences, and I got to go to a conference in the Netherlands, and it was people invited from mostly white nations around the world. There were 2 people from each country, and I was one of them. Ruth Moda had been invited, and she asked me to do it because she was so generous, and she knew I'd never been out of the country. And I went to talk about the last laugh.
What was the last laugh?
Okay, so long about the middle, maybe 89, 90, this woman comes to my office, and she wants to organize a bunch of comedians, professional comedians, to teach people with AIDS how to do stand-up comedy. Yes, she had brought this to the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and they just shut her down. No frickin' way, this is not funny, right? And she brought it to us, and I said, that's very enticing. I can name 5 people right away who would do that. Jim Schultz, you know. Anyway, so we went ahead and did it. I didn't realize the caliber of comedians she was bringing in, and they spent a weekend training people how to do stand-up. Everybody developed their own skit, and then there was a show, and the show was filmed, so it became the Last Laugh show. Very, very popular in the States.
What was the content?
It was each person telling their story, and it was the story through comedy. Like, I've stopped buying things at Costco because they're too big. I never know if I'll use it all. Things like that. So people kind of making fun of their situation, and also with pride. You know, nobody denigrated themselves, but they came up with a skit. And it was performed in Santa Cruz.
Where was it performed? What was the audience? What was it like?
Well, it was performed, I wasn't around. I was visiting my family and I couldn't be at the performance. I think it was at the big Sing downstairs, downtown.
Civic,
thank you. I think it was at the Civic. I'm not remembering. Sorry.
Anyway.
Old brain.
Yep.
An interesting thing is, it really was about U.S. culture, U.S. queer culture. It wasn't about anybody else's. And I found out that our culture does not translate in other communities, in other countries. So I brought The Last Laugh to a conference in the Netherlands, and it bombed. It bombed so badly.
You had video of the show.
I had video of the film, and I talked about us developing it and why we use that tool. But people in Europe are not repressed. Our role is, our models are Protestant, white, church people, and we still have that culture. We don't talk about sex. You know, it may be changing now, but it didn't change. It wasn't there then. And nobody in the audience of hundreds of people could understand what the hell I was talking about.
How mortifying.
Yes, yes. But I realized it's like this, sex isn't a secret there. They talk about sex from first grade, right? We didn't have sex ed in school.
Where we're doing all of this work to find all of these alternative, sneaky ways to get sex into the conversation.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. And they just did not understand it. They were kind to me. You know, the only person who understood it was my colleague, because there was one other person from the States, and he was an African-American gay man who worked for one of the big organizations in Washington, D.C. So we became buddies.
He got it.
He got it. The Australians got it a little bit because they're based on the same kind of culture, kind of repressed culture in some ways.
Well, good try.
It was so bad.
And it worked here.
And it worked here. It did.
Yeah.
It did.
What else can you say about the culture of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project, about how people interacted with each other, how they got along, what relationships were like, what the organization was like?
We were really pretty tight. We had weekly meetings. We could bring up our feelings. We could talk about what we were doing. There were a couple of times when people stepped over the line and kind of acted like a client or did something that wasn't quite legal because they wanted to protect the client. Like there was one time where a staff person went to a client's house and saw a gun. The client's partner was dealing drugs out of the house and had loaded weapons. Weapon one. People wouldn't go into the house because then we knew there was a weapon in there. So the other organizations decided that they weren't going to provide services because it wasn't safe. So this outreach worker, this person took the gun, brought it to the office, the SCAP office, and locked it in this flimsy 4-drawer file cabinet. But that meant that hospice would then go back and serve this client who was in his last days, right? And it was the only way he could think to do it. I got to get the gun out of the house so hospice will come back in. That was his intent. It was a good idea. He told me, and I immediately called the sheriff, who was our friend, and said, "We have a gun, can we bring it to you?" I don't think it was loaded. I'm not sure. So we brought it over to public health and the sheriff, and they took it and they destroyed it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And services continued to be provided.
Services continued. So there were those kinds of things that would happen that were kind of outside the bounds of what we should be doing for good reasons. People were doing it for good reasons. I was flipped out when I heard there was a gun in the office, especially in the neighborhood we were in. I didn't feel safe that somebody wouldn't find out it was there. It would be easy to break into that place. Yeah. So.
That's a little outside the normal scope
Yeah,
of your duties. Yeah.
Little. But it's just like Richard started doing outreach with needles that weren't legal.
Yeah.
It's like that's how we were a model. We broke the rules a lot of times because we had to.
And then you went public about it. Sounds
Yes.
like.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was interesting. Dr. Fauci just did an interview about what those times were like, and he talked about the people with AIDS who were shutting down the streets in Washington, D.C., lying in the street because nobody in the Department of Health would pay attention to them and bring them in to be part of the solution. And he said that. We made a mistake. And the only way they could get our attention was to do something really public and dare us to respond.
Well, and it worked.
And it did work. That was it.
It changed the model for drug trials. Mm-hmm. It changed the model for drug pricing, as I recall.
Yep.
I remember that AZT, which was a pretty crude tool, but it's all we had, was pretty expensive.
Yep. Yep.
I remember going to demonstrations at Burroughs Wellcome, who was the manufacturer of AZT, I think.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. ACT UP was great at targeting, who's really behind all this and how are we going to get their attention, And there was a lot of ACT UP shamed people into responding, Yeah.
How would you say that working at SCAP changed you?
Oh my God. It was the hardest work I'd ever done. Our job was to be family for people. So when someone new walked in, we had no idea, is this a client, is this a family member, whatever. They got attention right away. The focus was on who we were serving. And that meant staying genuine, not rolling back into, I'm not a, professional. We were professional, but we also were professional with our hearts open all the time, which wears you. It wears. I remember one of my friends that ran a program in San Francisco said, you have to take a break every 3 months. You have to get out of town. Go somewhere where nobody knows you and just relax. And I thought it was stupid at first. I was like, oh no, I'm gonna be fine. 3 months in and I was like, oh my God. Because once people found out that I had that job, everybody wanted to share. In the supermarket, in the movies, I'd see a gay man and wait for him to come up and say, I'm positive. So it was emotionally really draining. How it changed me was to stay in that place, to recognize that that was my genuine place, my genuine self, was emotive, and that was the gift I brought And what we did at the organization is we welcomed people with open arms and open hearts. They needed that, and we needed that. So I got that this is what being human is all about, you know? Yeah. I remember sitting, one guy came in, and I knew him, and his partner had just died, and he was a client, and this man was very angry. He was pissed. And he was pissed because he felt like his partner didn't get everything he needed in the end. And so I brought him into my office. I think I was in the middle of writing a grant. I pushed it all aside, and we sat there for 2 hours. And I had a window open behind me, and what I was doing when he was talking is the stuff I felt was true and real, I took in. The stuff I felt was his anger speaking and didn't really apply to me or us. His grief, I let go out the window. Yeah. We're still friends.
Are you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it was, you put anything down, you know? Whatever you're doing, the most important thing is the family you've created. So I got that organizing, creating community lesson at a very deep level. And I still kept doing it in other fields. Yeah, because it's real and it's what we're supposed to be.
It's an incredible gift to the community and an incredible gift for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really couldn't put up with the bullshit after that. I really, if somebody was bullshitting me, I'd be just like, stop it.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have time for this. Yeah. You know, people just talking about bullshit things. It really did take me a long time to be able to go to a party and just talk. Right?
Yeah.
You know it.
I do. That's an exhausting skill.
Yeah.
Go somewhere and say nothing for an hour.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What lessons do you bring from this experience, and what lessons might you offer to people today about political organizing and how you bring that to this kind of work?
I think the lesson is to start where you're at and think about the issue you want to address, because there's so many, right? And nobody starts with skills. Everybody starts just making it up. Seriously, right? And that's how I learned to organize, is I joined a group, an anti-war group. I was 22, and went to San Francisco and got arrested in the Saigon consulate. But it was really, I was learning from my elders. I also sat down a lot with the older people in Santa Cruz who did organizing. One of my friends, her mom was one of my role models, you know, and she was probably in her 60s at that time. But it was learning, we were all learning at the same time. Oh, I tried this and it worked. You know, it's kind of like when you first get a computer and you're trying to figure out how to work Word, you know, you teach each other, and anybody can do it. You know, sometimes people look, and younger people might look at people with a lot of experience and say, well, I can't do that. Look at, she's been doing that forever, you know. But I started somewhere, and really it just builds on itself. Bring people in that you like.
And can work with.
And you can work with.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're going to be challenged. And hopefully you'll challenge each other to do what's important, the focus of what you want to do. We seriously changed the world. Not Santa Cruz, all of us together. You know, if you build on, you know, there were a lot of lessons from the Vietnam War, There were a lot of lessons from the vets coming back. Many of them became the people who were doing the work around AIDS because of their experience being in a war zone. It felt like that to them, you know. So everybody was bringing their own experiences, you know. And we built on each other's strengths. We reinforce each other's strengths, and we care for one another, you know. Building community is about opening your heart. It really is. Can't do it any other way, at least I think.
Well, and the main lesson is anybody can do this.
Anybody can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just start where you're at and keep going.
Where I was at, I had been doing organizing and boycott work for the United Farm Workers, which had nothing to do, well, at the time had nothing to do with public health. It was about labor rights.
Right.
But we learned organizing, and we stood in lots of parking lots, and we talked to lots of people, and
Yeah.
slowly things changed.
Yeah.
And that was the experience I brought to. Well, then I realized I was gay, and then there was so much to do.
Yeah.
And then there was AIDS, and there was so much to do. But really, any organizing background will inform what you need to know.
Yeah. I got to march from San Francisco to Modesto in early 1975 with the United Farm Workers. And my dad was a union member. My grandfather was a union member. We were a union, working class, Irish Catholic union family. That was the definition of who we were. So I was always drawn to labor stuff. And it was amazing. The lesson I got, these were people who had been on strike for a year. They were farm workers. They had no money. They had no power. Their power was in their numbers. And Cesar Chavez organized this march where every community we came into, we went to a church because that was the center of the community. We got fed, we got a place to sleep, although I did sleep inside a church, inside the sacristy, which, you know, is like, whoa, you don't do that. And we got bigger and bigger and bigger every day. Like I remember walking down this just path in the middle of apple orchards, and there were these people coming towards us, and it was farm workers, and we went like this, and then we went like this, and we were together. And I had a grandmother whose grandchildren were translating for me, and we spent the rest of the day walking together. And at the end, when we got to Modesto, there were 10,000 of us.
Wow.
And Modesto is a really small town.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was so powerful. Yeah.
What
And they had no power except the people.
And
you
the
know?
visibility.
And the visibility.
And the commitment, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was pretty amazing.
Here's a tough question. What do you think would be different about Santa Cruz if many of the people we lost to AIDS were still alive?
We'd certainly be bigger. I think about the people who are single now, who lost their partners to AIDS. There would be more couples, more community in that way, you know, because a lot of them never hooked up with somebody else long term, you know. It's a hard question to answer. If we had something, we did have something that pulled us together because we were all queer, right? And in the most expansive definition of that word. And we were organized. I think that the queer community here would be more organized if AIDS hadn't happened because we wouldn't have lost all those people and we would have focused on something different. because we were going in that direction, you know. So we could have built more positive stuff, you know. But everyone going through that experience also created bonds that I don't know if they would have been there.
Seeing, watching, and helping your friends die together as a community is an incredibly profound experience.
It is.
Changes you for life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it makes you brave because what do you have to lose? Right? I don't mind getting in somebody's face. Kind of get my yayas out. Not be respectable. I like that. But the community was bigger then.
You think?
Yeah. Yeah. To me it was. Because I guess because those were the people I knew. You know, Gerald and Wesley and everybody who died.
Yeah.
They were there. They were part of our life.
Do you ever stop and think, what would Gerald think about this? What would Gary say about this?
I do for some people, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gerald would have giggled and organized behind the scenes. His spouse, because I considered them married, was just getting into organizing. Like he was thrilled because he had worked for the military his whole life. Mm-hmm. And these two gay men raised 5 kids? I think 5 kids together in the Army, right? So Wesley was just, his wings were just starting to unfold when he got really sick. Yeah. You know, because we'd have political meetings at his house. Yeah. And I remember when he died, his son was there, who was a grown-up, and his son took his fairy skirt.
Wesley's fairy skirt.
Wesley's fairy skirt.
Yes.
And put it on the bed. So Wesley was covered by his fairy skirt when he died.
It was a big deal to have this big black man with a military background, who I remember talking to him. He still talked like a military person. He would talk about the enemy and so on. And I remember the first time I saw him in a skirt, I was like, this is a big transformation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was proud in that skirt.
And you know, I never got to go to any of those fairy gatherings, but I'd hear who was there, and then I'd know, oh, they're part of the group. Mm-hmm. You know. Mm-hmm. Yes. Do you remember the bird when Gary died? And there was it Gary? At Coimbra, there was a program. I thought it was Gary, but it could have been anybody. But a bird came in. And birds don't fly into dark holes, right? And a bird came in and sat in the middle of the group. I wasn't there, I heard this. And sat there for the longest time. And then finally kind of checked it all out and found its way out.
Wow.
And it was like, okay, we just had a visit. Yeah. You know? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think I've told this before. I don't know if you were there. Is I had this dream, this imagination that all these people who died of AIDS around the world had a similar experience. They experienced prejudice. They experienced all these bad things, right? And they overcame. And then they died, right? And what happens to them? So in my dream, they've all come back. They're the generation that we're looking at. And they're back for a reason. Is it global warming? Is it global annihilation? But there's experiences that are deep there, I think, and gets carried on. I don't know if it's just, magical thinking or not, but I like to think of it that way.
That's certainly a way to hold them in your memory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to be inspired.
Continually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Now I'm choking up.
You lasted the whole way.
I did. God damn it.
God damn it, Joe, you made me cry. Yeah. So it's an army of angels
Yeah.
that are out there. And I wouldn't be who I am today, and you wouldn't be who you are today.
We would not.
No.
No.
And that's a gift.
Yeah. Through the ringer and out the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.